Thank you, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I was introduced as a distinguished personality. I hope by the end of this address, I could live up to that name. I want to start my address this morning by reflecting on the happy confluence of events, milestones, and anniversaries that has brought me to Bristol this year, and to take part in this conference to which so many of you from so many disciplines and walks of life have responded. I certainly could not have planned it, foreseen it, or even imagined it. This year marks the 20th anniversary of my graduation from the Bristol School of Education as a doctoral student. I had responded to a call by the Commonwealth Conference on Small States, which was held in St. Lucia in 1988, for native researchers to look into the particular circumstances of their respective countries. So in a way, I have accepted the invitation extended by the Chairman of Convocation, Bill Ray, for the class of 1994 to return to visit their university. But I'm also here at the specific invitation of the Graduate School of Education to celebrate with them the 20th anniversary of the establishment of the Education in Small States Research Group, which, led by Professor Michael Crossley, grew out of the research conducted at the time by postgraduate students in small island developing states. Therefore, in a way, I can be considered one of the founders of the research group, whose home was and still is the school's Research Center for International and Comparative Studies. And how well do I recall Edmund King's insistence that the central and abiding need is to get inside the context. That means true factual knowledge, fidelity to the system understood by the natives, and empathy for the problems seen by them. Since then, and to this day, Professor Crossley, my doctoral supervisor and mentor then, and my colleague and mentor still, has never tired of reminding us that, especially in these times of intensified globalization, context matters more than many policymakers and researchers realize. This year marks as well the 20th anniversary of the first United Nations Global Conference on Small Island Developing States, or SIDS as we now call them, which was held in the Caribbean island of Barbados to look into issues regarding the sustainable development of small island developing states. Out of this conference came the United Nations Program of Action, popularly known as the Barbados Program of Action. And this was a policy document meant to address the economic, environmental, and social developmental vulnerabilities facing islands, and to outline a strategy to mitigate these vulnerabilities. This program of action has been described as the only internationally approved program specific to SIDS, which has been collectively and unanimously endorsed by them. Since that historic occasion in 1994, there has been a Barbados +5 session at the UN General Assembly, a Barbados +10 conference held in Mauritius in 2005. And it was at that conference that culture was added as the fourth pillar of sustainable development. Before that, it was the social, economic, and environmental. And culture was added really at the insistence of small island developing states. And I chaired the panel on culture, and I think that was perhaps the most interactive session of any conference, UN conference, at least the ones I have attended over the last 17 years. But the whole assembly burst out in a spontaneous rendition of Bob Marley's iconic and universally recognized "No Woman, No Cry." Right? It was a powerful demonstration of the power of cultural products in SIDS. So this year, Barbados Plus 20 is scheduled to take place in Samoa in September. And we look forward to receiving the scorecard for the performance both of SIDS themselves and of the international community. And this year, of course, as you've heard, has been designated by the United Nations as the International Year of Small Island Developing States. And it will be interesting to find out at what pace the wheels of progress have moved. We are also observing this year a significant milestone in small states research. It is the 30th anniversary of the publication of Colin Brock's seminal work on small states, and we have Professor Brock here with us this morning. Scale, Isolation, and Dependence, Educational Development in Island Developing and Other Specially Disadvantaged States. And now scale, isolation, and dependence are now accepted as perhaps the main vulnerabilities of small states, so that Brock's recommendation for ongoing work on small states issues has significant relevance beyond the field of education. 4 years after the publication of this work in 1994, he would argue further that, and I quote, "Whatever the eventual answers to the problems of educational provision in small states might be, they will more likely be found if there is much more research both into the particular and general issues in the field. This means more in-depth case studies of individual systems, as well as more comparative analyses across the numerous range of small states," unquote. Brock's work and those of others that followed him, like Crossley, Holmes, Keith Holmes is somewhere, Mark Bray, David Achuarena, Mike Keller-Martin, all facilitated by the Commonwealth Secretariat and UNESCO's International Institute for Educational Planning, IIEP, have had a significant impact on my own work on small states issues, and particularly on tertiary education in small states. So I am indeed indebted to Professor Brock, as I am sure many are, for his pioneering work in this field. The last anniversary I want to highlight as being of particular significance to the theme of today's conference is the 30th anniversary of the establishment of the World Commission on Environment and Development under the chairmanship of Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway. The Commission was asked by the General Assembly of the United Nations to formulate a global agenda of change, one that would recommend long-term environmental strategies for achieving sustainable development by the year 2000 and beyond. It is the report of this commission, now widely referred to as the Brundtland Report, that proposed in the Tokyo Declaration of 1987 the often quoted definition of sustainable development, which is an approach to progress which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs, unquote. And with that report came an urgent appeal for collective action by citizens groups, non-governmental organizations, educational institutions, and the scientific community. The Commission's message of an integrated approach to sustainable development was addressed to governments and private enterprise, but first and foremost to people whose well-being, in the words of its chairman, is the ultimate goal of all environment and development policies, and to the youth in particular. Permit me, therefore, to say a special word of thanks to the main sponsors of today's conference who have heeded the Commission's appeal: the Graduate School of Education and the Cabot Institute of the University of Bristol, and Sazani Associates. For those of you who may not know, and I admit to being one of those until recently, The Cabot Institute is engaged in fundamental and responsive research on risks and uncertainty in a changing environment. As it turns out, this word of thanks to the Cabot Institute is also a personal one, because the Institute, through its Mosaic project, which is the management of slope stability in communities, and with Professor Anderson, has been involved in a landslide mitigation project in Skate Town, which is a vulnerable, unplanned urban community in St. Lucia's capital city, Castries. So truly, the world is much more interconnected than we think. Thanks to Sazani Associates for your work in small island developing states, which are increasingly threatened by loss of sustainable livelihoods in coastal and rural areas as a result of environmental degradation. I know your work covers the Central American and Caribbean region, and I think this morning I met maybe the coordinator from Belize. So I need either to locate your partners in St. Lucia, if you have any, or to initiate contact between you and them, since sustainable rural development is one of 3 themes of a community-based adaptation strategy currently being addressed by the Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program in St. Lucia. This roll call of anniversaries is not just simply a nostalgic look back at the past, but an attempt to bring together the many strands and perspectives that will inform my presentation this morning. A presentation entitled, Living on the Sharp Edge of Environmental Uncertainty in a Small Island Developing State, Challenges and Strategies from St. Lucia and the Caribbean. I propose to examine, first of all, the concept of environmental uncertainty. I will then speak to some of the challenges of simply being a small island developing state and the difficulties associated with responding to these challenges in a climate of uncertainty. This will be followed by an examination of some of the strategies adopted and under consideration by one grouping of small island states, those of the Caribbean. For specific initiatives, programs, and prospects, I will draw mainly on the experiences and strivings of my native island, St. Lucia. And I will end by examining the type of educational strategies that could assist the transition from environmental uncertainty to environmental sustainability in these small island states contexts. I now want to take a look at the term or the concept of environmental uncertainty. I was uncertain about the meaning ascribed to the term environmental uncertainty in the context of the conference theme, so that prompted me to Google the phrase in search of a universally accepted definition. Now, had I been a little more tech savvy, and I might simply have asked, I think her name is Siri, what's environmental uncertainty? The word environmental. Anyway, but I Googled, and the first definition I accessed read, environmental uncertainty is a situation where the management of a firm has little information about its external environment that is in a state of flux. So you could imagine I was in a state of flux. The second was only slightly more reassuring, as it offered the following insight, that environmental uncertainty is unsettled, shifting trends threatening environmental sustainability. It can be a situation where company management has little external environmental information on changes in the existing environment. And with a few more variations on the theme, I found some insights that were more instructive, particularly regarding the concept itself of uncertainty, and it was described as a situation where knowledge, nature of things, extent of consequences, events, conditions, or possible outcomes are not known. So navigating that literature was a daunting exercise for the layman that I was. But however, I deduced that the concept could be reduced to two principal components, both of which have to do with knowledge or lack of it. Lack of knowledge about the present state, and lack of knowledge regarding how a system will change in the future. However, there was a point made that environmental uncertainty at the organizational level can be not only a function of lack of quality information, but also the reasons for this lack of knowledge. That is, that the organization or the country or the individual is perhaps not doing what it needs to do. The situation became clearer when I read the summary to policymakers in the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in which guidelines were issued to enable them to interpret its findings. Now, the IPCC expresses degree of certainty both as a qualitative level of confidence from very low to very high, and as a quantitative likelihood from exceptionally unlikely to virtually certain, where virtually certain is set at 99 to 100%, and exceptionally unlikely at less than 1%. But I also did find a perspective proposed by the United Nations Development Program Bureau of Crisis Prevention and Recovery. I found it particularly instructive. In their view, uncertainty is considered not in terms of the probability of the hazard, but rather the probability of harmful consequences resulting from interactions between natural or human-reduced hazards and vulnerable conditions, while vulnerability is essentially the likelihood that the event will cause harm based on the social, political, economic, and physical conditions of the population or system representing the hazard. In light of the commonly held view that vulnerability is one of the main characteristics of small island developing states, I found this perspective to be of particular relevance to these themes. I'll now take a look generally at small island developing states. The particular circumstances of small states began gaining the attention of the international community in the 1960s with the work of economists and sociologists focusing on the economic problems and consequences of smallness of size. This was followed by a second wave of interest in the educational development, spearheaded by the Commonwealth Secretariat and UNESCO's IIEP. The third and current wave of interest in the consequences of environmental changes on the sustainable development of small island developing states began to gain momentum following the Rio Earth Summit of 1992 and the subsequent global conference on SIDS, which I referred to in 1994. And it is this last wave of interest that is the main focus of today's presentation. The three other pillars of sustainable development that I referred to, the economic, the social, and the cultural, will of course come into play since, as Commissioner Brundtland points out, and I quote, "The environment does not exist as a sphere separate from human actions, ambitions, and needs. The environment is where we all live, and development is what we all do in attempting to improve our lot within that abode," unquote. I'll now take a look at the challenges facing the Caribbean. And there on the screen you have a map of the Caribbean. Sometimes persons are not quite sure where to find the Caribbean, so I had a blown up map. So it's somewhere between North America, you can just see the tip of Florida, and then South America and Central America. So that's where the Caribbean islands are. Like most other small developing states, the Caribbean is highly prone to devastating natural disasters. It sits along a subduction zone within the Atlantic hurricane belt, and this shows you the hurricanes, that have affected that region over a period of, I think, 2 or 3 decades. It sits too along, as I said, the Caribbean subduction zone, so it is highly vulnerable both to cyclonic as well as seismic and other associated natural hazards. Its location, that is the Caribbean, is considered to be one of the highest risk areas of the planet, in spite of its long-held description as paradise islands or islands in the sun. And its vulnerability, or their vulnerability, is also attributed, though, to, first, their small geographic area. If you'll notice, the island of Anguilla is only 91 square kilometers. And that smallness of size accounts for the fact that disasters sometimes take country-wide proportions. So by the time a Category 1 hurricane traveling at 110, 120 miles an hour just blows, it blows over the whole of Anguilla. And St. Lucia also, for that matter. But the second point is that they depend for a substantial part of their gross domestic product on a few sources of income, agriculture and tourism for the most part, which can be severely reduced for months on end by a single catastrophic event. And in the slide there you have, agriculture with the bananas. That was our main, St. Lucia's, and most of the Windward Islands' main export crop. And tourism, both cruise ship tourism, this is the capital city of Castries, and land-based tourism. Incidentally, this is Jade Mountain with the pitons in the foreground, or is it background? And it has been said by some, well-eminent celebrities that if you haven't been to Jade Mountain, you haven't been anywhere. So, for those of you planning a holiday. There's also a limited capacity to reactivate the development process after a devastating event. In other words, they have a very low level of resilience. And the last one I want to flag this time is the difficulty of developing and implementing meaningful disaster mitigation programs because of the fragility of the ecosystems and their limited human resources. Now this was the coral reef off the coast of St. Lucia, and incidentally, after, next week, the Prince of Wales is holding a discussion, I wouldn't say a conference, on Commonwealth small island states, but looking particularly at the marine environment and looking at what is now called the blue economies and the ocean economies. A lot of it for the islands has to do with coral reefs and coastal zone management and to prevent coral bleaching, etc., etc. So this conference is probably, setting the tone for other conferences to follow, and of course leading up to some more in September. The region is therefore teetering, I say, on the sharp edge of environmental uncertainty as a result of the effects of climate change, climate variability, extreme weather conditions, which often lead to land degradation either from drought, or flooding, or landslides, or sea level rise. I can recall, for example, when the active Atlantic Caribbean hurricane season lasted for just 1 month. That's in the 50s, 60s, with the public awareness campaign containing the rhyme that you learned at school: June, too soon. July, stand by. August, come it must. September, all over. October, remember. Now, however, the Atlantic hurricane season lasts from June the 1st to November the 30th, leaving the islands on tenterhooks and in disaster preparation mode for 6 months every year. And then, of course, the other 6 months we're trying to bring it back to where it was. Usually, it's taking 2 steps backwards. This year is no exception, with 21 named storms forecasted, and 1 has passed. That was Hurricane Arthur. Fortunately, it was a little further north along the Florida coast. Most of the island settlements, including their capital cities, are coastal zone settlements. Some, like St. Lucia's capital city, Castries, even lie below sea level and on land reclaimed from the sea itself, and therefore prone to flooding by high water tides. There is also the continuous threat of damage to infrastructure and disruption of administrative and economic activity, because if the capital is destroyed, then things come to almost a standstill. The rural settlements are themselves not very far away from the coast. If you look at the case of Anguilla, if it is maybe about 6 miles across, there isn't, a lot of distance to go from the coast to the rural settlement, if you want to see what I mean. The islands rely heavily on coastal and marine resources, which call not only for their constant management, but also for appropriate land use policies in the inland settlements, because then whatever happens inland comes down into the marine coast. And partly because of their small size and because of their vulnerability to natural and environmental disasters, the Caribbean, like most island developing states, are classified as high-risk entities. This has led to insurance and reinsurance being either unavailable or exorbitantly expensive, with adverse consequences for reactivating the development process after a catastrophic event. The Honorable Derek Walcott, the St. Lucian Nobel Laureate in Literature 1992, I like to put that in, could well have been referring to the precarious and vulnerable nature of the Caribbean when he warned in his Nobel lecture that, and I quote him, "A morning could come in which governments might ask what happened not merely to the forest and the bays, but to a whole people," unquote. We now come to some of the responses, the strategies that the Caribbean, have taken or are considering to deal with these challenges. It goes without saying that none of the small islands in the Caribbean could begin to successfully address these challenges on their own. Regional strategies, regional initiatives, and frameworks have been put in place to manage some of these responses. And the first one I want to refer to is the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, or CDEMA. With over $5 billion in losses in the Caribbean during the last 2 decades of the 20th century, CDEMA was established in 2009 to deal with disaster response, but also with all aspects of comprehensive disaster management for its participating states. And it focuses on all cycles of the hazard and on all sectors of the society, and it concentrates on all hazards. So you've got fire and hurricanes and flooding and cyclones. The second initiative is the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. It's based in Belize, which is a CARICOM member of state in Central America, but being on the Caribbean coast, Belize qualifies as a Caribbean country. It is based in Belize, and it is the regional mechanism that coordinates the Caribbean's response to climate change, serving as the focal point for information on climate change issues and the region's response to managing and adapting to climate change. The third initiative, the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility. It is a Caribbean government's fund for earthquake and hurricane catastrophes. It is a risk pooling facility owned, operated, and registered in the Caribbean to serve Caribbean governments and their communities in reducing the economic impact of natural catastrophes by quickly providing short-term liquidity when a policy is triggered. And it is said to be the world's first and to date only regional fund using parametric insurance. So they've taken the lead in at least one initiative, how to build up resilience after a natural disaster. It is said to represent a paradigm shift in the way governments treat risk, and as I said, it is seen as leading the way in pre-disaster planning. So the significant contribution of that facility to resilience building must not be understated. Apart from just having this pool, there's also a technical assistance program, there's a scholarship program, there's provision for climate risk adaptation insurance, even including a product called excess rainfall policy. So you can actually take out a policy for excess rainfall. Don't know how they measure it. But, the fourth initiative I want to draw your attention to is the Environmental and Sustainable Development Unit of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. The Eastern Caribbean States is a 9-member organization with responsibility for the provision of natural resource and environmental management services to member states to ensure the sustainability of livelihoods of their peoples. So in this slide we do have, this is a mangrove swamp, and it's, you know, for mangroves, they help stem the flow of silt from inland areas down into the city, so into the sea, so it acts as a barrier. But it's also a great hatchery for fish and other sea life. And this is another conservation area. So these are two of the projects that I selected just to give an idea of what the unit is doing. One of its outputs has been the St. George's Declaration of Principles of Environment Sustainability, and that was signed in 2001. And it outlines 21 principles for environmental sustainability in the OECS countries. And at least 3 of these are of particular relevance to the issue of environmental uncertainty, because they focus on a broad-based environmental education and awareness. There's a preparation for climate change aspect, and there's an integrated disaster management approach. The unit's flagship project is the Protected Areas and Associated Livelihoods Project, and that's why I said we need to get in touch with Sazani Associates, because they do so much work in protected livelihoods. And the other initiative, the University of the West Indies Seismic Research Center, As mentioned before, the islands of the Caribbean lie in an active volcano and earthquake belt, with hundreds of small earthquakes occurring each year. Consequently, the region has pooled its resources again to maintain a seismic research center at the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies to serve as the official source of information for earthquake and volcanoes in the English-speaking Caribbean. So we have, an eruption in the bottom picture, and the earthquake monitoring. Now, volcanic eruptions do not occur very frequently, but when they do, they can be very deadly, as they did, as one of them did in 1997 with the Soufrière Hills volcano in Montserrat, which completely destroyed the capital city, Plymouth, and the island's economy to the tune of $500 million US. And I don't know, those of you from the UK would remember that after this catastrophe, Montserrat, being still a British colony, had to assimilate, a large portion of the population, at least for a while, until they got back on their feet again. Then there is the Center for Resource Management and Environmental Studies, called CERMES. This is a program, a multidisciplinary program, based at the Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies, this time in Barbados, and it promotes and facilitates sustainable development in the Caribbean and beyond. So there are 3 of those projects. SOCMON, which is socioeconomic monitoring for coastal management. There is another project on access to water, and one of their main fortes is community-based coral reef monitoring and management project. And the last regional initiative I want to highlight is the Caribbean Youth Environment Network. This is a non-profit organization dedicated to improving the quality of life of Caribbean youth by facilitating their participation in the development process and promoting their full development in all matters pertaining to the environment and sustainable development. There are national chapters, and they have, education and public awareness activities. One such activity in St. Lucia was a recent lecture and panel discussion on climate change and small island developing states. Now, if the print is not too small, you see, held under the distinguished patronage of Her Excellency Dame Pearlette Louisy, Governor General of St. Lucia. I thought I would have put that slide in, And they also have a declaration which they are trying to get 10,000 signatures to present to the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition, calling on present and future governments not to compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs, but to mainstream sustainability as the first and last principle in every decision and development, and to operationalize resilience as a measurable outcome in every decision made now and in the future. So in that declaration, they have put, the buzzwords there: sustainability, resilience, and there's something called the precautionary principle. So the World Economic and Development Commission had stressed, if you recall, the importance of youth involvement in addressing issues of the sustainable development of our common future, which was the title of the publication put out by the World Commission for Environment and Development. So this youth network is one of the region's responses to this imperative. So these regional initiatives and strategies, though, however impressive they may seem, are not without their own challenges as far as their own sustainability is concerned. Because most of them depend on external funding for their establishment, and ongoing operation. We talked about the Caribbean Risk, CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. It's owned by the government, but it was capitalized by other countries, the IMF, Canada, UK, Japan, so even to establish that facility, which we are saying is one of the only one in the world, it still depends for its establishment and, as I'm sure, for its continuing, sustainability on external funding. Should this level of funding be reduced, I say it is debatable whether the region would be in a position to sustain these efforts. The ideas are homegrown, but their sustainability depends on the assurance of a strong partnership with the international community and on enhanced international cooperation and action to address their sustainable development challenges. It is to be hoped that the Samoa Conference will give serious consideration to this issue, even while we all acknowledge that we are living in a time of global financial challenges. I now want to take a look at St. Lucia in particular, and the challenges and strategies which we have used. Like most of its sister islands, St. Lucia has made some significant efforts both at the national and regional level to mainstream sustainable development principles into its national development plans, its policies and strategies. But as I said, it does have its challenges and vulnerabilities which affect its ability to deal with life on the sharp end of environmental uncertainty. St. Lucia is situated in the lesser Antillean arc of the Caribbean archipelago, and as we said, in one of the most active storm and hurricane belts in the world. And as we've seen in an earlier slide, along the subduction zone, where the North American or the Atlantic lithospheric plate is slowly diving beneath the Caribbean plate. So that is what is triggering a lot of these, small earthquakes, over the past few years. Although the director of the seismic unit has warned that we are due for a massive one. Things that we have been too complacent, and we really should brace ourselves for a massive quake. In February this year, there was a 6-month quake that affected 5 of the islands, but they were, very low down on the seabed, so there wasn't a lot of damage on the surface. So St. Lucia's location makes it highly vulnerable to weather, climatic, geoseismic events, stresses, and episodes. It's a little bigger than Anguilla. It's 238 square miles. It is, in fact, one of the largest of the small islands, 238 square miles. And what that means, it is 42 kilometers long, 27 kilometers wide. In fact, yesterday, a young man told me within an hour or less than that, he had cycled 30 kilometers. And I thought, he could have gone all around St. Lucia. That's Sam. He could have gone all around St. Lucia in an hour. In fact, and you can't go all around St. Lucia in an hour. Now, St. Lucia is volcanic in origin. It's rugged in topography, and you can see the ridge along the center, the steep slopes, and most of the flat or gently sloping land is situated along a narrow coastal belt. So the very light shading, that's where most of the settlements are, both the towns and villages. It lies within the northeast trade wind belt. It's influenced by all kinds of weather systems, the Atlantic high pressure system, the intertropical convergence zone, surface, mid and upper level, low pressure systems, tropical waves, frontal systems. It's therefore vulnerable to all the anticipated impacts of global climate change, including those likely to be caused by the increase in the number of high category hurricanes expected, and the economic impact. And as an example, I want to refer to the impact of Hurricane Thomas in 2010, which gives us an indication of the level of damage which can be expected in the future. Although it was only a Category 2 hurricane, you have Category 1 to 5. The 5 is the really big one. But Category 2, 120 miles an hour or thereabouts. Although it was a Category 2 hurricane, the damage was extensive. The total damages and losses estimated at $336.2 million US, which doesn't say much because, but when you read that, that amount represents 43% of the island's gross domestic product, 9 times the contribution of agriculture to GDP, 3 times the contribution to tourism, 62% of all our exports of goods and services, 19% of our gross domestic investment, 47% of the public debt, and what was really struck us was 80% of the recurrent and capital expenditure that was approved for that year. And that was one hurricane. That was Hurricane Thomas. And it happened in the second quarter of the financial year. So we had to borrow, and of course that's affected our public debt. And 3 years later, St. Lucia was still recovering from that single natural disaster, only to be hit by a trough, which caused, and that was on Christmas Eve, when everybody, was preparing for Christmas with all their goodies. And a trough caused damage in the amount of $100 million US, equivalent to 8.3% of its GDP. And these pictures just to give you an indication of the kind of damage that is both for the Hurricane Thomas and the Christmas trough. And we have the main arterial road, so that cut the island in two, and it took a while to be able to move from north to south. Then I have the damage to infrastructure. It's kind of a quite substantial building, once, and it's now on the sharp end or teetering on the edge of environmental. The next, again, is a collapse of the road network with undersurface water. A culvert, it just collapsed, caused a few deaths. That is the water catchment area and slopes, so you can see all the brown patches. That's just silt that has come down from the mountain. That is our Roseau Dam, which is the main, one of the main dams in the country. There's you could see it's all cloudy, there's a lot of silt. And in fact, although that happened in 2010, we still have not been able to desilt the dam, which is now causing which is now causing water problems this year. And so we are on a water advisory, a lot of things are banned and so. The damage, again, as a village in, I think that's Soufrière, and a few others. And in fact, the recent Commonwealth Third Global Biennial Conference on Small States held in St. Lucia in March of this year, under the theme, Building Resilience in Small States, there was a sobering remark made that based on research thus far, St. Lucia could very well be currently the most vulnerable country in the world. So it is a bit, frightening. We talk about coastal zone management, and as a result of trunks, trees, vegetation, all manner of things along the coast. Eventually, I suppose, they'll go out to sea and settle at the bottom, but this is what one is talking about, the declining ocean health because of all this siltation and all this vegetation. Again, just flooding. I think we talked about widespread flooding. Again, You can see they're teetering on the edge there. And the last one, again, you could just see again the row of houses and all the denuding of the slopes. And the problem is that, it's a volcanic island, so all that, I suppose, is years of ash and lava. So when all this comes down, what is left is rock. So the issue is, how then do you reforest, all those slopes? So the government of St. Lucia, through its ministry, we now take a look at some of the strategies that we have been putting in place to deal with the results of environmental degradation like that, and generally climate change. The Ministry of Sustainable Development, Energy, Science, and Technology has taken the lead in formulating policies and strategies to deal with these threats. And there I've named 5 of them. They have articulated a climate change adaptation policy. There is a St. Lucia strategic program for climate resilience. There's a program on adaptation to climate change. That one, the pilot program, which was then subsumed into this one. And a national environmental education policy and strategy. This is still a work in progress, but I've been informed that should be out by the end of the year. So that's why I said they either have been adopted or under consideration. Now, these strategies reflect government's continuing efforts at addressing its undeniably pressing environment issues, but they require translation, as I said, from policy to concrete action. And if you notice, I have an adaptation policy, I have an education policy, I have a strategic program. The issue is, how do we translate that into concrete action? And I'm saying therein lies another challenge. Considering our high levels of debt servicing, we are above the recommended percentage for debt to GDP. We have passed 75%. And what is in fact a bit troubling is it's now difficult to borrow, even if the Caribbean governments wanted to borrow, it is now difficult to borrow because the lenders are not quite sure, of our ability to repay. So that, in some countries there have been retrenchment of the public service to be able to bring down the government's, sort of wage bill and all manner of problems and the issues. But we, as I say, it's a high level of service debt. We continue to depend on external assistance, and all these are common characteristics of small island developing states. Now, a measure of the country's success in awakening the national consciousness is the interest shown by various parastatal organizations, non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, community-based groups, and affiliated agencies. And among them, the National Emergency Management Organization, or NEMO, that's responsible for ensuring the efficient functioning of preparedness, prevention, mitigation, and response of both natural and man-made disasters. The St. Lucia National Trust, established by an act of parliament to help conserve our built and natural environment. And they are the ones that have put together a youth environment forum, again, to involve young people. And one of their successes is what we call Greening Fair Helen. Now, St. Lucia, well, the term greening, there's reforesting. And it's called Helen because St. Lucia is referred to as the Helen of the West Indies. because of its famed beauty. And for those of us who know a little of Greek mythology, Helen of Troy. And St. Lucia was named after Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships and all that. So that's why it's called Greening Fair Helen. And one of the projects was part of our Diamond Jubilee project. In fact, I was trying to replicate the UK's Jubilee Woods. Now, mind you, the Jubilee Woods project had 60 acres each wood, but you know, if we had 60 acres and 60 woods of 60 acres. But our target was planting 5,000 trees. So that was part of St. Lucia's Diamond Jubilee project, and those trees were planted along river courses and on the slopes after Hurricane Thomas. We have the St. Lucia Red Cross Society that has a group of persons called the Caribbean Response Development Teams. We have the global, although it's not an organization, it's a program, the Global Environment Facility Small Grants Program, funded and operated by the UNDP. And they are doing quite a bit of work, very interesting work, with marginal communities to achieve environmental sustainability with an emphasis on the poor and to build capacity. So we'll speak a little more about that facility later on. But apart from these structured programs, you know, there are many interventions by all manner of government agencies, community groups, religious organizations, everybody. There's edutainment, it's called, via the electronic media. There's popular theater, seminars, workshops, camps, field trips, tree plantings, beach cleanups, all these to spur on people to keep, you know, to prevent further degradation of the environment. And I say, if enthusiasm levels were indicators of the degree of sustainability, then St. Lucia could look forward with some hope to stemming the hemorrhaging of its lifeblood. But you know, behavior modification takes time, and time is not on our side. So I ask, how then do we accelerate this behavior modification that would save small island developing states from losing their already precarious hold at the sharp end of environmental uncertainty and prevent them from falling into the deep end? The prevailing recommendation is that of mainstreaming education for sustainable development and into all aspects of educational planning and delivery, since it is seen that is education for sustainable development is seen as a key approach to bringing about the behavior change necessary to tackle the consumption patterns resulting in climate change. I mean, the Commonwealth Secretariat itself that did a study but considered that based on the findings of its research, efforts to implement ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, have mixed results. The Commonwealth Secretariat describes ESD as not a new initiative to be undertaken on top of everything else, but rather a set of principles that can be interwoven into existing initiatives and programs to add value to their delivery. And it should be thought of not as an add-on, but as a fundamental way of conceptualizing education. But I think that in that definition is where we have a few problems. What are the set of principles, and how can they be interwoven into existing programs? In fact, in the Caribbean, I'm saying this set of principles, are they contextual or are they universal? Is ESD, as some Caribbean academics have described it, as another fad, another northern agenda, so they're not, you know, killing themselves with it? Indeed, even from the North, even from the UK itself, there is some skepticism about, education for sustainable development and that definition. Many, I think, would subscribe to the conclusion that Frances Nichols arrived at in her study of education for sustainable development in the national curriculum of the United Kingdom, in which she concluded that, and I quote, "The severity of the environmental crisis as it is reported does not seem to be reflected in the type of action that is being taken in relation to education and the national curriculum. If the concern is as urgent as it is suggested, and education really is as significant in this change as many believe it is, then the government needs to take more drastic action. ESD needs to be better defined to allow for precise research and assessment, and all levels of education and society have a vital role to play if real sustainability is to become meaningful and mainstream in order to cause real change." So, ESD in the Caribbean, in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, well, that is evidence as far as I was able to dig up, it is fair to say that education for sustainable development has not entered the popular lexicon of Caribbean governments or their peoples. In spite of convening a Caribbean regional conference on education for sustainable development in 2005, when the Caribbean launched the United Nations Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, there are those who argue that even at the close of the decade, no Caribbean regional policy for ESD exists. That although Caribbean governments have signed all the relevant international agreements, they have not formulated regional or national policies for ESD, that they appear not to recognize the interrelatedness of these sustainability problems, nor do they seem to focus on education as the basis for developing a sustainable society. Now, this may be an overgeneralization, in light of some of the strategies that I have referred to, but there isn't any, as I mentioned, no specific focus on ESD. And I would say that in St. Lucia, it is the non-formal sector that has been left to take the lead in education for sustainability. And the gains that have been made can be attributed to the approach being used in their projects and programs in which elements of sustainability are incorporated. The programs and projects are in the main, they are community-based, they are participatory and inclusive, they are intergenerational, that is, they bring all the community together, so you have persons of all ages, and I think this facilitates the transmission of local and traditional knowledge, and they are capacity building oriented with a strong focus on monitoring and evaluation and a strong focus on knowledge and information management. This last strategy of knowledge and information management, I think it has not been given the prominence that it deserves in the education system of our small island developing states. If we look at the definition, it is the systematic management of an organization's knowledge assets for the purpose of creating value and meeting tactical and strategic requirements. It consists of the initiatives, processes, strategies, and systems that sustain and enhance the storage, the assessment, the sharing, the refinement, and the creation of knowledge. The use we make of knowledge and information affects how we work, how we share, how we create, how we sustain any form of development. In fact, Sir William Arthur Lewis, 1979 Nobel laureate in the field of development economics, and again, and a national of the small island developing state of St. Lucia, I like to put that in, had argued that the fundamental cure for poverty is not money, but knowledge. He may very well have been way ahead of his time in this regard. Now, he would have celebrated his 100th birthday next year had he lived. His birthday is the 23rd of January. So next year we celebrate the centenary of Sir William Arthur Lewis. Now, I'm saying he may have been way ahead of his time, since the concept of a knowledge society and a knowledge economy now enjoys widespread international favor. Okay? We made reference earlier to the fact that the two principal components of uncertainty was lack of knowledge about the current situation, as well as lack of knowledge about how this situation will change in the future. It could therefore be argued that an increase in knowledge would bring about a decrease in uncertainty. And therefore, knowledge creation and knowledge generation at all levels and in all spheres is paramount. And therefore, so is knowledge sustainability. And it is for this reason that there is renewed attention to the documentation and transmission of local and traditional knowledge in this new dispensation. And I think the head of school had indicated, her interest in looking at, the now new focus on traditional and local knowledge. A partnership between the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College in St. Lucia and the local small grants project undertaken by the UNDP using the information and knowledge management strategy holds exciting promise for the future of ESD in small island developing states. How easily this strategy can be mainstreamed into all levels of the formal education sector, though, is what needs to be addressed. So it's easy to do it in small communities, in small groups, but how do you mainstream that into the formal education system? The Mauritius strategy, remember that the second global conference on small states was in Mauritius in 2005, and there a strategy was formulated, and it recognized that in the contemporary global context, the wealth of a nation depends more on its ability to produce, to exchange, and transform knowledge than on its natural resources or industrial production. More than most, islanders are very conscious that the future of any institution, country, or region depends in large part on the depth and quality of its human capital. More than any time in history, the success of individual, cooperation, or nation is based on knowledge, connections, creativity, and engagement, and on how a country manages its workforce. So therefore, priority attention should be directed at promoting educational development and sustained capacity building to strengthen knowledge societies throughout small island developing states, to better prepare them for dealing with the challenges associated with today's environmental shifts. So, the way forward, or the way ahead. Small island developing states are a fact of life. And I said, and so too is increasing environmental uncertainty. That is, if we don't do anything about it now. One of the early commentators on the issue of smallness of size took a very practical approach when he stated that short of war, when you annex other countries and other hostile activities, there's not much that small island states can do to increase their national boundaries. There is a certain finality about it. They start with it and will probably finish with it. They accept it as a fact of life and operate within the national geographic constraints which it imposes on them. But now we have another constraint which is imposing itself upon us, and that is the challenge of environmental uncertainty. They have no choice but to learn to live with it, to adapt to it, and to build up their resilience to absorb the shocks when they do strike. I therefore want to end my presentation by quoting two observations made at the third Global Biennial Conference on Small States I mentioned before under the theme Building Resilience in Small States. And one of those reads, stymied by frequent and prolonged economic and weather-related shocks, small states have been severely challenged to accelerate economic growth and improve their development outcomes. The limited ability of these economies to withstand or bounce back from adverse shocks is evidenced by the experience of extended periods of economic downturn and eroded social gains in the aftermath of shocks. Building resilience is therefore an important element of small states' efforts to withstand inherent and policy-induced vulnerabilities and fully embrace and benefit from globalization. And the second is that small states are highly susceptible to natural disasters, and we saw for hurricanes. The amplified impact of factors and actions taken that are beyond their control means that the implementation of sustainable environmental resource management regimes is critical. So, what do? We have to admit that the precarious situation of small island developing states is not one of our closely guarded secrets. Everybody by now knows that. Environmental certainty remains our greatest challenge. Although we have shown leadership in international efforts against it, both in calling for ambitious mitigation targets to be adopted by the larger states and in undertaking innovative adaptation measures at home, some of these we offer or can be replicated elsewhere to good effect, proving that small states can be contributors to the world if they are given the right enabling environment. Because every challenge, every vulnerability has a resilient response. I recall when I was doing my work on small island states, and we kind of lauded some of the strategies. And there were some critics who said that small island states are making virtues out of necessities. That has allowed us to be creative, be innovative. And as it is said, you're never too small, never too poor to teach somebody something. So small states, as you notice, we have had some strategies. Granted that we may not have been able to implement all of them, but the idea is there. The ideas are homegrown. So the way ahead lies in finding sustainable responses to our challenges and vulnerabilities. Education for sustainability, or shall we say with Edmund King, education for uncertainty. And mind you, Edmund King used that phrase in 1978, education for uncertainty. That must be the watchword for small island developing states now and in the foreseeable future. So as we go into the Samoa conference, we look to support, assistance, and cooperation from the developed world and the international community to build resilience and sustainability in the small island developing states of the world. Genuine and durable partnerships will go a long way towards addressing issues related to their sustainable development needs. And the hope of one delegate from St. Lucia, not me, who will be traveling to Samoa is that small island developing states would soon be in a position to transition from a vicious circle of increasing vulnerability to a virtuous circle of increasing resilience. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your indulgence.
To find further information, you can go to www.smallstates.net.